All right, juniors, so we're going to talk about the Reformation in England today, which has to do with Henry VIII and his 6 wives, but really today we're only going to talk about 2 of his wives, the first 2, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, okay? So the Reformation in England occurs largely because Henry wants an annulment from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so that he can marry Anne Boleyn. So we're going to talk about that narrative today, okay? So, Catherine, we'll start with her. She is the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, their old friends from Spain, okay? And they were very good at trying to marry off their daughters to powerful monarchs to build alliances throughout Europe. And that's what they did with Catherine. She was the youngest of their daughters. And they married her off to the heir of the English crown, which initially was a guy named Arthur, okay? Arthur was the Prince of Wales. He was the heir to the English throne. He was the eldest son of Henry VII, the first monarch in the Tudor dynasty for England, okay? So Isabella and Ferdinand want to marry their daughter off to the heir of England, so they marry Catherine to Arthur, okay? Arthur dies less than a year later of what's called the sweating sickness. Got married in 1501, he's dead in 1502, okay? The logical thing to do is for Catherine to marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry, who will become Henry VIII, King of England, okay? Now, Catherine's position was a little bit precarious. Why? Because after 1504, 2 years after the death of Arthur, her mother dies and leaves the kingdom of Castilla to Catherine's older sister. What this means is that Catherine is not bringing as much to the marriage as was hoped on the part of the English. Henry VII isn't so sure that he wants the new heir, his younger son Henry, to marry Catherine, okay? Catherine stays in England, however, to try to persuade the King of England to let her marry the prince. She's not really successful, but she's very tenacious, and she's very well educated, and so she stays in England trying to get this, trying to basically fight in order to be able to marry Henry. And one thing that she claims is that she never consummated the marriage with Arthur, okay? She never consummated the marriage with Arthur. And that was important because if she had, they would have had to get a papal dispensation. Why? Because according to medieval Catholic Church laws, if a woman marries, when a woman marries a man, okay, and they consummate the marriage, that establishes a blood relationship between this woman and her husband's family, meaning she's considered legally the blood sister of Henry, okay, which would of course break the be a prohibition. You can't marry someone too closely related by blood. So they would have, even though there's not like they're not in the same line, the law is there's a blood relationship established through the consummation. Point is, she said it didn't happen, so they wouldn't have needed a papal dispensation, she argued, okay? That was another of the obstacles to her marrying the prince, besides the fact that she was not going to inherit the wealthy kingdom of Castilla. Okay, now, Henry VIII becomes the king in 1509. 1509, he becomes the King of England. His father is dead. One of the first things he does is he marries Catherine, okay? He likes her. Also, in order to make sure that the marriage is not in any question, even though Catherine says they don't need the papal dispensation, Henry gets the papal dispensation, okay? So even if Catherine had consummated the marriage with Arthur, from the point of view of the church, it's a solid marriage. It had a papal dispensation to say that there could be an exception made in this case because, you know, this consanguinity laws are things that can be changed. The nature of marriage could not be changed by church laws, but who you're allowed to marry at any given time, as long as it's male, woman, man, that's something that could be adjusted, especially in this case, since they're not descended of the same people, right? So they get this papal dispensation in 1509, and they get married. Okay. And they have an okay marriage for a while. The problem is, of course, she's not able to produce a male heir. The only living child, and she has a number of children. Most of them die before birth. But the only child to survive is Mary, who was born in 1516, the Princess of England, okay? Mary, born 1516. Okay. Now, Henry, after the birth of Mary and after the failure of Catherine to produce an heir, starts to become interested in other women, okay? We know he has, I think, at least 2 mistresses, maybe only 2, okay? But it's in 1526, that he first becomes interested in this woman, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn, okay? She has been away from England for most of her adolescence. She grew up mostly in France, in the court of various noble women, including in the court of the Queen of France, where she was educated. And she's born in about 1501. She's coming of age around 1520 in France, and it's probably in France that she gets connected with some Protestants and converts to Protestantism, okay? And she brings that back with her to England. So by 1525, she's one of a few Protestants in England who are kind of under the surf. You know, they're legally they're not supposed to be Protestant in England. Again, baptized Christians in the medieval world are supposed to follow the teachings of the Church, Catholic Church. So Anne Boleyn is converted secretly, okay, and she's now back in England. And Henry falls for her in 1526, okay? And Anne refuses to become his mistress. She insists that Henry marry her and make her the Queen of England, okay? Now, Henry, in order to do this, has to annul the marriage with Catherine, meaning he has to get a legal statement from the church saying the marriage never happened, okay? And so that's what he sets out to do starting in about 1527. He's looking for an annulment. And we call this the King's Great Matter. That's what people at the English court referred to it as. And what they meant was the attempt to get an annulment. Okay? And Henry puts on the job to get this annulment from the church. He puts on the job this guy, Thomas Wolsey. Now, there's going to be 4 Thomases we talk about today, so it's very confusing. So I tried to write them. I wrote them out over here. So try to keep them in your mind. Thomas Wolsey is the guy who is trying to get the annulment for Henry and Catherine. He is the Archbishop of Canterbury. He is a cardinal of the Catholic Church, highest ranking officials in the church under the Pope. And he is also the Lord Chancellor of England, which is the highest ranking official within the royal government. So he has a high position both in the Catholic Church as well as in the English royal government, okay? And he is charged with getting the annulment, okay? He's an enormously fat Thomas. So we're going to have a bunch of different Thomases. This one is the enormously fat one, okay? All right. And the second Thomas that I'm going to talk to you about is this one, Thomas Cromwell. He's a clerk. He's educated in law, but he's basically a secretary. And he's working at this point for Thomas Wolsey, working with him to try to get the annulment, okay, of Henry and Catherine from the Pope, all right? Now, they don't have a very good legal case. Really, this annulment has no chance from the beginning. No chance, okay? Why? Well, Henry claims that the Bible forbids you from marrying your brother's wife, and he quotes Leviticus here. It's Leviticus 18 or 20. I don't remember. But Leviticus says something to the effect, you may not marry your brother's wife. Well, the church was well aware of this. They knew the Bible. The church knows the Bible very well. The whole thing is built on the Bible. Catholic Church. So they then say, look, there's another verse we have to deal with, which is in Deuteronomy, which says you ought to marry your brother's wife. If he dies and leaves no heirs, then it's your duty as his brother to carry on for him. So how do we reconcile these two things? Well, the church had long ago reconciled the two things by saying, look, you can't marry your brother's wife while your brother's alive, right? That's why King Herod wasn't supposed to be married to Herodias in the gospel, because his brother was married to her and his brother was still alive, right? Okay, so look, there's no argument that Henry has in the Catholic Church that's going to work, because they say the Bible's very clear on this. All right, so there's no chance he's going to get this legal argument, okay? Politically, it's also not going to go through, because the Pope is wanting to be on the good side of the Emperor, Charles V, and the Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, is the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. He's the son of her sister, her older sister, Juana, okay? So the Pope doesn't want to offend that guy politically, and legally, there's no chance of it, and biblically, there's no chance of it. So Henry has no case in court. So the annulment fails. And it fails in 1529. That's the year the annulment fails, okay? And so in 1529, Thomas Wolsey here, 1529, is accused of a crime called praemunere, which means he was more loyal to the Pope than to the king. And this was Henry's first attempt to attack the church as a distinctive institution. And then Thomas Wolsey is later charged with treason. So he's going to get beheaded, possibly. But he dies before he can be charged with treason. So he dies, but he doesn't die through execution. Okay? So Thomas Wolsey dies in 1529. He was the Lord Chancellor, the highest ranking officer in the royal government, and he is replaced by this Thomas More. Thomas More becomes the Lord Chancellor of England. Thomas More was a lawyer and humanist. He was trained in the law. He was a great scholar in the humanist tradition, okay? He was also a very devout Catholic and a great friend of Henry VIII. And that was why Henry VIII put him in this position, because he was his great friend, okay? Now, this has resonances for earlier times in English history. There was an earlier Henry in the 1100s, Henry II, who put his best friend, another Thomas of Becket, in the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury because he thought Thomas of Becket would do what he wanted there, do his bidding. Thomas of Becket didn't. Thomas of Becket tried to be a good churchman. And as a result, he ended up getting executed in the cathedral, okay? There's some resonances here, right? Thomas More is put in this position of Lord High Chancellor because Henry VIII believes that Thomas More will do what he wants, okay? He's his good friend, all right? Now, Thomas Cromwell, meanwhile, after Wolsey dies, starts to try to ingratiate himself with Henry VIII and impresses Henry VIII with his intelligence, and then gets brought into the royal government, the royal household, as a clerk, as a secretary, okay? So now Thomas Cromwell has also moved into the king's circle, okay? All right. Now, in 1529, Henry's frustrated. He's been trying to, marry Anne for a little while now. It's not working out. But Anne has sort of started to convert Henry to some Protestant ideas, okay? And in particular, she has introduced him to the ideas of William Tyndale, who brought very traditionally Lutheran ideas into England in regard to the relationship between church and state. The idea was that the state should determine what the religion of the people is. There should not be an independent church, okay? This is an argument put forward in the obedience of the Christian man, okay? And Anne Boleyn shows this book to Henry, The Obedience of the Christian Man. And so in 1529, the same year that the annulment fails, the same year that the king's great matter fails, you have Henry calling together the Reformation Parliament, okay? So the Reformation Parliament comes together. In in 1529. Okay, so again, look, or it's convened. Henry convenes it. Same year that the annulment fails, same year that Wolsey dies before he can be charged with treason, same year that More is brought in as the Lord High Chancellor to replace Wolsey. Okay, same year that this Thomas Cromwell starts to ingratiate himself with the King of England. Okay, so 1529 is the Reformation Parliament. All right, what does Henry do in the Reformation Parliament? Okay, he attacks and essentially abolishes the distinction between the church and the state. That's his goal. And this whole plan is devised by Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell is sort of the legal architect of the Reformation, and his main goal here in the Reformation Parliament, Thomas Cromwell, is to make the church subservient to Henry VIII. Okay, so the way they do this is they charge all of the clergy with this crime of praemunere, that is, being more loyal to the Pope than to the King. Okay, and again, this is to say, look, you can't have your primary allegiance, your ultimate allegiance has to be to the king. It can't be to another bishop. What that means legally, right, is that there can't be any division between the king's authority and the church's authority. The king is over the church and controls the church. That's what Henry wants. Okay? And he charges the clergy £100,000, and they don't have the money to pay it. Okay? And so they go along with it, and they accept the charges, and they accept Henry's pardon for them, which means they accept his authority over the church. And so the independence of the church is abolished in 1531 when the clergy are pardoned by Henry, and in exchange, they recognize his authority over the church. Okay? So what is the kind of the essence of the Reformation in England? It's the abolition of a distinction between church and state. The subjection of the church to the state. And this is accomplished in 1531 with the pardoning of the clergy. So the church becomes subordinate to the state in England. And of course, this would be the English church, okay? All right, that's 1531. The following year, 1532, Henry secretly marries Anne Boleyn. The following year, Catherine is banished from court. Anne Boleyn moves into her apartments there in the palace on the Thames River in London, right? And the following year, 1533, Henry and Anne are publicly married, okay? And now we have a new Archbishop of Canterbury. Wolsey was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now we have a new Thomas here, Thomas Cranmer, okay? And Thomas Cranmer is a Protestant. So he's the first Protestant Archbishop in England. And he declares the marriage of Henry and Catherine void and declares the marriage of Henry and Anne valid. Okay? And same year, 1533, Henry and Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, is born. Okay? Now, Catherine was fighting very, very hard this whole time to maintain her position at court, to maintain the legitimacy of her title as the Queen of England, and she was very concerned not only with, the truth and her own position, she was also concerned with her daughter, because if this marriage is declared void, then her daughter is going to be declared illegitimate and taken out of the line of succession. So she's fighting very hard for this, okay? Ultimately isn't successful because all the clergy go along with it except for one guy, one bishop, John Fisher was his name, and he got executed, okay? All the high clergy, bishops, okay? But all the while, Catherine of Aragon is saying, this marriage was valid, this marriage was never consummated, there's no legal argument, but it doesn't work out for her, okay? So 1533, that's done. The supremacy of Henry over the church is solidified in law by the Parliament in 1534 was something called the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy. What this did, the Act of Supremacy did, was it confirmed in law that Henry was the head of the Church of England, controlled it, okay, and that everyone had to acknowledge it. Not just the clergy, but the lay people had to acknowledge it. And they had to swear an oath acknowledging Henry as the head of the church, okay? And then there was another law passed, the Treason Act of 1534, which said if you didn't sign this oath and recognize Henry as the head of the church and deny the religious authority of the Pope, then you would be charged with treason, okay? So Henry's old friend, Thomas More, who had been Lord High Chancellor, who had replaced Wolsey, he's a devout Catholic. He refuses to swear and legally and recognize Henry as the King of England, and so he is executed by his old friend Henry for doing that, for maintaining loyalty to the Pope and remaining Catholic. Okay, so he's there. He's considered a saint by the Catholics, but also by the Anglicans. Interestingly. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop today. The English Reformation. Okay, very good.